Holocaust history, memory, and the enduring relevance of the era. We will re-examine the importance of the Holocaust as a moment in time, but also as a component of a larger history of the Jewish people and the other victim groups, and well, within overall human history too. As you'll see and learn today, the context of the Holocaust is so important of this era to the past, but also to the present and to the future, to the Jewish people and to all of humanity. The anti-Semitism, racism, bias, bystanding, and outright violence that existed then and there has never dissipated. Today, it is here and now. Additionally, to note, the acts of heroism and possibility for human unity and resistance against despotism, against atrocities and barbarous cruelty are also available to us today as they were then and there. We can learn valuable lessons from those times and the people in them then and there, and can bring them here, to the here and now, to our students. I'm eager to share in this learning and exploration together. Today is Yom HaShoah, or Yom HaZikaron LeShoah LeGvura. It is translated to Holocaust Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Day. Holocaust Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Day is a national day of commemoration in Israel, and for the entirety of the Jewish community, on which the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust are memorialized. It is a solemn day, beginning at sunset on the 27th of the month of Nisan, and ending the following evening according to the traditional Jewish custom of marking a day. Places of entertainment are closed, and memorial ceremonies are held throughout the country of Israel and around the world to mark the day and honor the deaths of those who passed, as well as the valiant acts of heroism by those who resisted fascism, anti-Semitism, and the Nazi plan to destroy world Jewry. I'm pleased to share in this opportunity with you all today, as we will hear from Holocaust survivor Carla Pepperzak, who participated in the Dutch resistance. Additionally, we will hear from her two daughters, Yvonne Pepperzak Blake and Marian Cummings. We will also hear from our friends from the Holocaust Center for Humanity and have the opportunity for question and answers at the end of the presentations. So to begin our event today, I would like to start with defining the Holocaust. The Holocaust was the murder of approximately 6 million Jews by the Nazis and their collaborators between the German invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 and the end of the war in Europe in May 1945. Nazi Germany and its accomplices strove to murder every Jew under their domination. Because Nazi discrimination against the Jews began with Hitler's accession to power in January 1933, many historians consider this the start of the Holocaust era. The Jews were not the only victims of Hitler's regime, but they were the only group that the Nazis sought to destroy entirely. That definition comes from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Other victims included Soviet civilians and prisoners of war, non-Jewish Poles, Serbian civilians, the disabled, Roma Shinti people, Jehovah's Witnesses, male homosexuals, and an assortment of political and ideological opponents. The murders were carried out in pogroms, mass shootings, starvations, hard labor, as well as in gas chambers in the back of trucks, and finally at fully fledged extermination camps, such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. The persecution began in stages, progressing into a set of fully operational government programs administered from Berlin. With that, I want to thank you so much for joining us today as we honor the lives that were lost, as well as those who participated in acts of resistance and heroism against the Nazi oppressors, and the importance of carrying the enduring lessons of this era into our current and future educational endeavors. Today, right this minute, we are streaming live on YouTube. The recording will be available shortly after the presentation, if not immediately after, and will be available in perpetuity as a teaching tool for years to come. If for whatever reason you cannot attend the entire webinar, please note this recording will be available to you after the fact. Please note that closed captions are available for today's presentation. They can be found by clicking on the CC icon in your Zoom toolbar. To hide captions, click the CC button and select Hide or Show Subtitles to your need or liking. Next, for OSPI's vision, mission, and values, all students are prepared for post-secondary pathways, careers, and civic engagement. That's our vision. Our mission is to transform K-12 education to a system that is centered on closing opportunity gaps and is characterized by high expectations for all students and educators. We achieve this by developing equity-based policies and supports that empower educators, families, and communities. We have 4 values: ensuring equity, collaboration, and service, achieving excellence through continuous improvement and the focus on the whole child. Our equity statement at OSPI: each student, family, and community possesses strengths and cultural knowledge that benefit their peers, educators, and schools. Ensuring educational equity goes beyond the quality, so there's a difference. It requires education leaders to examine the ways that current policies and practices result in disparate outcomes for our students of color, students living in poverty, students receiving special education and English learner services, students who identify as LGBTQ+ and highly mobile student populations. It requires education leaders, us in this room, this Zoom room, to develop an understanding of historical contexts, engaging students, families, and community representatives as partners in decision-making, and actively dismantling systemic barriers, replacing them with policies and practices that ensure all students have access to the instruction and support they need to succeed in our schools. Next, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the traditional lands of the Stay-Chas Band of the Squaxin Island tribe, lands also traveled by the Nisqually, Chehalis, and Puyallup peoples. These are Coast Salish Lushootseed speaking peoples. I give honor to the elders and their descendants, who are stewards of these lands since time immemorial. I am truly blessed to reside here in this beautiful region and to give honor to the teachings, people, and customs of this place throughout my work and in my personal life. In regard to best practice, please engage with your tribal neighbors, ask questions, be a learner, be a listener, have humility, and seek to understand from a place of compassion and goodwill. Please remember, each tribe are the experts of their history, and as it is taught by the peoples of this land and by the sages of my own people, if we take care of these lands and waters, they will take care of us. Thank you. I'd also like to share some tips for participation today. We are in a webinar format, and thus interactivity does look a little different. So please feel free to share comments, ideas, and other information in the chat panel, and select all so everyone can see them. Additionally, if you have specific questions you'd like to ask our panel of presenters, please put them in the Q&A section where we can address them during the question and answer period at the end of the event. We will also be sure to share the contact information of our main presenters, just in case you would have any follow-up questions for us or need for resources. Additionally, after the fact, we'll have today's slides available for you if you attended the training via PD Enroller registration. I'd like to introduce our speakers for today in name and title. You'll hear more formal introductions as we each appear, but just to put names to faces. On this slide, I'll introduce our presenters for the first portion of today's event. Paul Regelbrugge, Director of Education, Holocaust Center for Humanity. Ilana Cohn-Kennedy, Chief Operating Officer, Holocaust Center for Humanity. And myself, I'm on the right in that picture. Akiva Erazim, I am Holocaust Education Liaison with OSPI. Here we have some more presenters from left to right. Julia Thompson, Education Program Manager, Holocaust Center for Humanity. Carla Pepperzak, Holocaust survivor, participant of the Dutch Resistance and member of the Holocaust Center's Speakers Bureau. Yvonne Pepperzak Blake, daughter of Carla Pepperzak. And Marian Cummings, also a daughter of Carla Pepperzak. And you'll hear more from these four in the second portion of today's event. So, we are here for a few reasons today. One I've already mentioned, to mark Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. But really, we have a few learning objectives and goals for today's training. To provide educators with a rationale for Holocaust education, borrowing from Holocaust pedagogy literature and Washington state data, as well as the distinct historical character of the era to affirm its ongoing and enduring relevance. Additionally, to acquaint educators with the Holocaust, as well as RCW 281-300-115, the Holocaust Instruction Law, as well as the teaching and learning best practices developed by the Holocaust Center for Humanity. Additionally, to provide educators the opportunity to hear survivor, witness, legacy testimony of the Holocaust, a social emotional learning opportunity, which will concretize the power of testimony as a pedagogical method, as well as to reinforce the first objective, the continuing relevance of learning about the Nazi atrocities against the Jewish people and the various other victim groups. Before we go further, I'd like to pause on this photograph. It was used for the advertising for today's event. It was on our first slide, and it could be seen by individuals on PD Enroller, Twitter, LinkedIn, and many other places. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Here in this picture, we see a collection of faces staring back at us. It is in black and white, taken in the year 1931 in a town called Salonika, in what is today Greece. Salonika is a Ladino, Judeo-Spanish name of this place, but you might be more familiar with the Greek name, Thessaloniki. One writer remarked on the vibrancy of this Jewish community, at one point even calling it the Jerusalem of the Balkans. Here in this photo, you can see dozens of Jews and a local military guard at a schoolhouse taking refuge after a terrible calamity. The caption of the image reads, "Jews take refuge in one of the local schools after a pogrom destroyed their community." The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum provides more information. During the night of June 29, 1931, and continuing into the early hours of the next morning, the entire Jewish settlement of Camp Campbell was destroyed by fire and 500 families made homeless when Greek Christian refugees and ethno-nationalists from Asia Minor unleashed a pogrom. Scores of Jews were injured in the attack, and one Jew and one Christian were killed. While this event is disturbing to hear about, it was not unusual for these times as anti-Semitism once again reared its head in Europe. It was only one of the many pogroms and violent incursions against the Jewish people, only following the pattern of history, the long thread of genocide and events that have plagued Jews since exile and expulsion from the ancient homelands in the Middle East. This pogrom in Salonika was only one of many moments in the prelude to the Holocaust, one of the many canaries in the coal mine. It was not from a vacuum, as we will also explore here in a few slides, but a natural continuation of a millennia of Jew hatred. For a time, things were peaceful for Jews in this region of the world. Not always pleasant, but not always deadly either. This pogrom, though, and the rising anti-Semitism of the times turned Salonika, a town that at one point was at home to 50,000 Jews, toward its dark descent into the depths of anti-Semitism, joining the other nations and regions who contributed to the totality of the Holocaust. By the end of the war, only 2,000 of the 50,000 Jews in Salonika remained. As a part of the local context here in the Puget Sound, it's interesting to note here some of the Jews who lived then and there in Salonika and nearby coasts managed to escape to America. And if they were lucky enough, if they were prescient enough to see what was to come, they found some amount of safety here in the United States. Many happened to arrive here to the Seattle area, and the descendants of those who were then and there are here with us, living on the Puget Sound here and now. It's one reason Seattle has one of the largest Sephardic populations in the United States, why Ladino can be heard to this day by native and heritage speakers in the Seattle area. This picture is only one of so many, a frame of one community among so many that were decimated by bias, hate, anti-Semitism, racism, and the Holocaust. I find it poetic they took refuge in a school here, a place that can act as a sanctuary and safe place for the downtrodden if we allow it to be. May we continue to create this kind of space in our own work. Next, I'd like to touch on two of the main goals of Holocaust education from an academic perspective. One scholar, Lindqvist, writes that the primary objective of Holocaust education is to help students to understand that the Nazis' attempt to annihilate European Jewry was an official state policy. Students should walk away knowing that the state government facilitated this industrialized extermination. It was a matter of government policy, and it permeated the society and culture of Nazi-occupied Europe. The Holocaust was state-sanctioned. Additionally, Holocaust education should familiarize students with how genocidal behaviors were committed by civilized and educated people, not deranged fanatics or monsters, as Hannah Arendt aptly wrote in her epilogue to The Banality of Evil. Quote, "The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal," unquote. While yes, the Holocaust was a result of deeply entrenched anti-Semitism and so many other factors, the fact still holds that such a powerful impact was able to occur and be able to be carried out to such an extreme was largely because individuals stood by and did nothing. And in many cases, these ordinary people also facilitated the grand machinery. Sadly, the Nazis were like any of the people we know today in today's society. They were people like us. They were corruptible humans, indifferent humans, humans who needed to protect their families, humans who were easily swept up. And that's what makes the era all more troubling and worthy of unpacking. By learning more about the Holocaust, we in turn learn more about ourselves. Much like the larger goals I mentioned about the Holocaust from academic literature, the Holocaust Center for Humanity, the creator of Washington's required teaching and learning best practices, has designed 4 outcomes or designated 4 outcomes from this important instruction. A perfect distillation of the power of this teaching and learning can be found in them. So students should walk away knowing what the Holocaust was. The Holocaust was a genocide, as I defined at the beginning of this event, involving the state-sponsored systematic persecution and annihilation of European Jewry by Nazi Germany and its collaborators between 1933 and 1945. 6 million Jews were murdered, as well as millions of non-Jews, including Roma, Shinti people, people with disabilities, Slavic people, especially Poles and Russians, homosexual men, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others for political and ideological reasons. Students should walk away knowing that the Holocaust, like other genocides, was fueled by prejudice, hatred, and intolerance. Students should walk away knowing that the Holocaust could not have occurred or could not have occurred at this scale if more people would have protested, resisted, or otherwise opposed Hitler and the Nazi Party. Students should also walk away knowing every person, young and old, has a voice. Every person has the power to speak out against hatred, prejudice, and intolerance, and in so doing can help make the world more inclusive for all. With all that said, when engaging and learning about the Holocaust, it's best to practice refamiliarization with the definition of anti-Semitism, as it is an intrinsic and inextricable component of the Holocaust atrocities. So on the slide here, you'll see a definition of anti-Semitism that has been adopted by the Puget Sound Jewish community. So I urge you to read the full statement at another time. It's available on the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle website. That being said, it's a working definition, but nonetheless, it's helpful in discerning what is and what is not anti-Semitic. So I'm going to read it for you. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. So as you can see here, and really any reputable definition of anti-Semitism is the focus of the hatred against the Jewish people and those who are perceived as Jewish. I want to highlight that there's no such thing as Semite. That was an old Nazi racial group like Aryan or any of the other terms that were created in their myth-based race concepts. This word can be confusing because it's anachronistic and stems from German Antisemitismus. In 1879, Moritz Steinschneider crafted the term with the help from other Nazi predecessors in Germany. It's a placeholder for Judenhass, Jew hate, and reflects the desire to elevate the philosophy around Jew hatred at a time to something more sophisticated in the times when scientific racism was highly popular. The word has been used since then to describe hatred of the Jews and echoes of an older time, and it's frankly the best term we have despite its nefarious origins to describe Jew hatred in its various dimensions. So next, I'm going to showcase the Holocaust in a broader context of anti-Semitism from long before and after the events between 1933 to 1945. While indeed, there were other victim groups which do deserve our attention, Jews were uniquely targeted in the events of the Holocaust, which is why we must take time and attention to the history of anti-Semitism and its manifestations. Like all genocides, the Holocaust is universal in its lessons, but also has its own particularness to it. It is always important to reach this balance when doing the instruction. We should express the universality of the events of the genocide, but be careful not to de-Judaize the events of the Holocaust. That is to say, every genocide has aspects, questions, and lessons that are particular to it, but also universal. So in regards to the Holocaust, we must always remember the other victim groups, but also give a specific focus to the Jewish people within the story. I will remind everyone today, one of the particular or unique things about the Holocaust is that Jews were the only group that Nazis sought to destroy in their entirety, as I have already mentioned. The only group mentioned in Hitler's last will and testament to destroy, as well as the group with the largest number of victims in the Holocaust. This does not detract from the other victim groups, but does ask of us to dig deeper into the Nazi focus on the Jews. For this reason and more, it truly requires us to look at Jewish history, the history of anti-Semitism, human history, and how did Europe get to the point it did? Where did this Jew hatred begin? Why were Jews specifically otherized, dehumanized, and targeted for murder? Well, as you see here on the slide I have, which is truly an incomplete timeline of anti-Semitism, I share this with you because it makes a few important points, especially I believe in regard to teaching the Holocaust, as well as introducing individuals to the story of the Jewish people. Number one, Jews didn't start or end with the Holocaust. Number two, anti-Semitism didn't start or end with the Holocaust. The Holocaust was part of a longer arc in which Jews have been experiencing hate, violence, and atrocities across history, with the Holocaust being one era in the greater pattern of Jew hatred over time. The Holocaust didn't happen in a vacuum. So, when doing Holocaust education with fidelity, I plead with you to include the story of the Jewish people before and since then, the history of anti-Semitism before and since then. It is human history, and it gives a deeper understanding of why the Jews were targeted with such ferocity by the Nazis. It also provides credence to why we need to study the Holocaust, but especially in the context of Jewish history, human history, to better grapple with it. Holocaust education is more effective when we assume a more holistic approach in teaching and learning, including the important historical, social, and cultural contexts. It gives us an understanding of why anti-Semitism takes so many manifestations which continue today, as we'll see here on the next slide. Really, anti-Semitism can be found in any group and expressed by any individual, no matter their race, ethnicity, cultural background, ideological orientation, and other identity markers. Anti-Semitism can be found across the political spectrum, on the right, in the form of neo-Nazism and white supremacy, racism, and theories of Jewish Zionist occupied government, where that Jews are reptilians with space lasers, controlling the banks and influencing education, thanks to George Soros. It can be found on the left, in flattening Jewish identity to just white people, conflating Jewish experience with the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or white experience, or putting Jews into a political social litmus test to decide, is this a good Jew or a bad one? Or going beyond criticism of the state of Israel, which is appropriate or fine, encouraged even, to calls for its total destruction or the death of the Jewish people who live there. It can be found among the religious, among Christians who blame Jews for the death of Christ. It can be found among those who follow Islam, who view Jews as unrightful, illegitimate infidels. It can also, though, be found among atheists like the Nazis or the Soviets. It was in the Soviet Union that Jews were seen as rootless cosmopolitans to be sought out and destroyed. Additionally, you can read about Soviet anti-Semitism in regards to the Night of the Murdered Poets, the Doctor's Plot, and other issues that arose in the USSR. You can see some of the manifestations of anti-Semitism on this slide, and there's a great amount of research, detail, and nuance in unpacking each category. My main point here is that there are many forms, a flavor for everyone, if you will. The important thing is to recognize how the definition of anti-Semitism plays a role in each kind. And I urge you to listen to your Jewish friends when they sense or see anti-Semitism around them. Next, I will provide some reflection on Washington state and national data on the Holocaust knowledge and anti-Semitism events that are happening in the present. Then we can move forward to our next speaker. And I do see your question here in our Q&A, and I'll address that just a little bit later. So keep them coming. Thank you. So, to again speak to the relevance of Holocaust education, I would like to return to something I presented last year, the most recent claims conference study, which I also mentioned during last year's event, like I said. It's the most recent and comprehensive data we have on all 50 US states on millennial Gen Z knowledge of the Holocaust. On September 16th, 2020, the Conference of Jewish Material Claims Against Germany released this highly publicized representative study on one of the main takeaways from that study was the shocking data regarding Holocaust knowledge and ignorance across the country. Here are a few takeaways from that study, especially in regard to Washington state. 12% of millennials and Gen Z in Washington state believe Jews caused the Holocaust. 34% of millennials and Gen Z in Washington state cannot name a single concentration camp or ghetto from the Holocaust. That number is 50% in Oregon. 58% of millennials and Gen Z in Washington state have seen Holocaust denial or distortion on social media or elsewhere online. So along with the events that happened since that survey, credence is given to the necessity of Holocaust instruction, an instruction which embodies anti-bias messaging, as well as the inclusion of combating anti-Semitism in its curricula. From recent events, on the left here, you can see the city of Kent. Assistant Police Chief Kammerzel, who is the recent subject of news coverage after he was caught shaving his mustache like Hitler, wearing lederhosen, making jokes that his grandfather was involved in committing the atrocities at Auschwitz and putting Nazi insignia on his office door. He refused to step down despite pressure from the mayor, police chief Padilla, and every conceivable local Jewish community organization. On the right, you can see headlines from the recent Coleyville Synagogue hostage crisis. 4 Jews were held hostage for close to 11 hours. They were saved by the rabbi's quick thinking and acting due to active shooter trainings. But the Jewish community was and still remains disturbed at the silence from the supposed allies during and after the event. Next, you can see on the left a recent incident from January in New York City. A woman spat on a group of Jewish children saying, "Hitler should have killed you all." On the right, you can see images from where individuals, also around the time of January, they left flyers, graffiti, vandalism at the Anne Frank Memorial in Boise, Idaho. The ADL does a great job of tracking anti-Semitism through its tracker of anti-Semitic incidences, but it can't capture them all because in too many cases, folks simply won't report them. I will highlight quickly composite images of the various incidences from their tracker that were recorded publicly from this past February. So you'll notice this is illegible because there are so many unique incidences. These include stabbings, bomb threats, vandalism, the dispersal of anti-Semitic leaflets, cemetery desecration, physical assaults, and personal property destruction. These incidents occurred across the United States, but many of them in Washington and Oregon. Here are the incidences from March. And here are the ones from April. Before I went on leave, I've been on leave since April 15th, and I didn't update the slide. And you can see here, things are a little bit more legible. And this is really only the tip of the iceberg. Every couple of days, these incidences occur, whether you hear about them or not. And I share this not because this is a competition or anything like that. For me, DEI, fighting hate, anything involving social justice is a yes and conversation. What affects the Jewish community affects you too, or it will down the line. And we must all work together to address it. I show you all this not to try to upset you or to decenter any other conversations, but because it is a matter of life and death for my community, and the lessons of the Holocaust are clearly still relevant. And even beyond these anecdotes, though survey data tells a damning story, the ADL's data, the FBI's hate crime statistics, the AJC's reporting all point to the rampant anti-Semitism on the rise in our society. I'll take a brief pause first here on this AJC data. This data comes from the State of Anti-Semitism report from the end of 2021. Here in the first question, you see how much of a problem, if at all, do you think anti-Semitism is in the United States? 90% of American Jews see it as a problem. The general public, 60% of them see it as a problem. Question 2, over the past 5 years, do you think that anti-Semitism in the United States has increased, stayed the same, decreased? 82% of American Jews say it has increased. Only 44% of the general public says it has. So from this, you can see there's a perceptual difference between Jewish Americans and non-Jewish Americans. Jews are perceiving an elevated amount of anti-Semitism in this country, which is clear and backed up by evidence based on the reports from the ADL and FBI, while the non-Jewish population does not see it as being as prominent or as much of a problem. So here you can see a news posting from the ADL Pacific Northwest, sharing the FBI data, which confirms that indeed, while Jews only make up 2% of the population, only 2%, 57% of all reported religious-based hate crimes were directed against Jews and Jewish institutions. And so with that, again, I will say, in order to do equity work with fidelity, to do true DEI, you must include the fight against anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, racism, hatred, they were then and there during the Holocaust. It was then and there in so many eras. And sadly, it is here and now, as you've seen across these slides, here and now in 2022. It reinforces the importance of anti-bias education and eliminating all forms of hate to create a more civil society. And lastly, I actually just added this slide 30 minutes ago because I felt it was pertinent to all the information I just shared. And this information was just announced this week. This week, the ADL released their audit of anti-Semitic incidences in 2021. The number of incidences has reached its highest since the ADL started collecting this information in 1979. From a national perspective, anti-Semitic incidents tracked in this report reached an all-time high of 2,717 in the United States last year, an average of more than 7 incidents per day, and a 34% increase year over year, including assaults, harassment, and vandalism. Too many Jewish communities had direct encounters with hate, and too many Jewish institutions, from schools to synagogues to community centers, have been reminded that they are vulnerable as incidents targeting these institutions climbed 60%. And the information I shared earlier wasn't an alarm bell. Surely this is. There's not a week that goes by that something doesn't happen. Holocaust education and instruction seeks to address this all, as well as racism and other forms of bias, as well as to bring to the reality to the statement, never again, if indeed that is truly possible. Holocaust education is an encouragement of media criticism, recognizing despotism, speaking out against injustice, and the assurance of upstanders who will stand against the tides of villainy. For me personally, this instruction is deeply valuable. It is existential. For my family, my community, it is existential. For everyone here in this Zoom or who will listen to this recording, it is existential. And so with that, I'm going to conclude. And I'm actually going to pass it over to the Holocaust Center for Humanity. And it's my sincere honor to invite Ilana Cohn-Kennedy from the Holocaust Center to share on her portion of the presentation. Good morning.
Thank you so much, Akiva. And that was a very thorough introduction with tons of information. With your permission, can I share my screen? I think, yeah, great. Okay, bear with me for just a moment here. All right, hopefully you all can see that, all right. As Akiva said, I'm Ilana Cohn-Kennedy. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the Holocaust Center for Humanity. In 1944, 16-year-old Henry Friedman emerged from a loft in a barn. He could barely walk. He was completely emaciated and his muscles atrophied. For 18 months, he had been hiding there, fighting for his life alongside his mother, brother, and teacher. His beautiful historic Jewish town of Brody, near Lviv, Ukraine, had been decimated. Of the 10,000 Jewish people living there, only 100 survived, and Henry was one of them. 45 years later, Henry has made a life for himself in Seattle, and it is here that he again experiences rising anti-Semitism and takes notice that students have never heard of the Holocaust. In 1989, Henry, along with a group of survivors, form a Holocaust Center in Seattle. Its mission is to teach the lessons of the Holocaust, inspiring individuals of all ages. Hold on one second. To confront bigotry and indifference, promote human dignity, and take action. Over the last 3 decades, the Holocaust Center has grown in size and scope, welcoming visitors to a museum, serving the entire community with programs, speakers, scholarship, providing professional development like this one, and resources to school districts across the state, and supporting students and teachers in classrooms. Through our programs, educational resources, and museum, the Holocaust Center changes hearts and minds. I want to highlight 2 of our programs, which you will likely hear more about through today's program. First, our Speakers Bureau. There is nothing like learning about history from a person who was there or from one of their descendants. These firsthand accounts bring the stories to life. Julia Thompson, who you will meet later in this program, is our outstanding education program manager and runs our Speakers Bureau. When you request a speaker for your classroom, school, or group, she will pair you with one of our speakers. Second is our field trips, both virtual and in person. These give students the opportunity to explore the Holocaust Center's exhibit, Finding Light in the Darkness. Through artifacts and stories of local Holocaust survivors, students will begin to understand the history of the Holocaust and that their choices make a difference. Our museum is also open to the public on Sundays. It is just one of many ways we serve and work with the greater community. Today is Holocaust Remembrance Day, as Akiva said. On this day, we remember the 6 million Jewish people and the millions of non-Jewish people who were targeted and murdered, in the Holocaust. 6 million Jewish individuals, 1.5 million of them children, 2/3 of the Jewish population in Europe, centuries of Jewish history wiped out by the Nazis and their collaborators. If we were to take a minute of silence for each of these men, women, and children, we would be silent for 11.5 years. As we watch the news and horrific images coming from Russia's attack on Ukraine, we recognize that we have a responsibility as a museum and as an educational organization that works with teachers and students. Museums like the Holocaust Center for Humanity are bearers of history. By housing the artifacts and documents of the past, we ensure that the truth, both noble and horrific, of what humanity has done remains shared and accessible. The stories we tell are ones of destruction and pain, and of the bravery of upstanders who risked their lives to do what was right and help others. We not only aim to educate and to honor our survivors' wishes that their stories are not forgotten, but to make a better future where the stories we tell are no longer repeated. Educators, you are the heart of our work at the Holocaust Center. We admire the great work you are doing, and we know that it's far from easy. This subject is hard, but it's worth teaching in every way, and we are here to help and support you. Thank you to all of you for attending today's professional development program on Holocaust Remembrance Day, and for your commitment to teaching about the Holocaust and sharing these lessons with your students. I'll turn it back to Akiva, or over to my incredible colleague, Paul Regelbrug, who taught about the Holocaust as a school teacher for more than 15 years. You'll be lucky to hear from him today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ilana. And so, yeah, I'll pick it up now and I'll start screen sharing. I really appreciate your information, and it's a true honor to get to work with the center. I joined the center in 2019, very shortly after the Holocaust education law was passed. I'm going to share a screen now to show you what that looks like. And so I'll address that, because really once the Holocaust education law came into being in 2019, it represented kind of a shift of a significant higher connection level or higher connectivity level between our work, our resources, and how we're trying to engage and connect this education across the entire state of Washington. So what you see there, RCW 28A 300.115, very simply comes down to this. Really, in our state, although there are about 20 states in our country where teaching about the Holocaust is required, in the state of Washington, it is presently strongly encouraged. It is not on a requirement level like since time immemorial is, strongly encouraged in grades 6 through 12 in all public schools in our state. However, importantly, as you can see here, that as a result of this law, OSPI contracted with this expert Washington nonprofit organization, and that is us, the Holocaust Center for Humanity. And we were charged with this role or responsibility to develop best practices and guidelines for Holocaust instruction. And so that's where we basically work together with a number of educators across the entire state, working with educators who are very experienced in teaching about the Holocaust, and also some that have never taught about it, because we wanted to make sure that what we were going to create would not be esoteric, would not be inaccessible to any teacher, right? We wanted to make sure that we're providing and grounding educators with what they need for whatever time requirements or restrictions they have, whatever grade level, whatever subject. Because having been a teacher, as Ilana alluded to with me for over 15 years, I know all too well about some things being just too much work for a teacher to be able to figure out and translate and make and to feel successful for whatever objectives and rationale I have, so that my students could be successful. So we tried to make it really adaptable and differentiated for any and all teachers, no matter their background, knowledge, or experience. The other thing, though, that I want to say, because I'm going to show you a little bit about those best practices, where you can find them and how they sort of play out across our community, is that though, again, remember I indicated that though teaching about the Holocaust is strongly encouraged, not required, however, once we created these best practices, which came into effect in the fall of 2020, there is a requirement that if you are teaching about the Holocaust, then you are sort of required or mandated to adhere to what these best practices and guidelines are. Okay. And last, before I leave this page, I want to show that, because this is a key point here, the intention or the rationale. Having been a teacher, and I want to convey this fact here, really, that teaching the lessons of the Holocaust, teaching about the Holocaust, is never to teach history for history's sake, or English language arts for simply addressing certain skills. Those things all will absolutely be part and parcel of the learning. Why? Because I, as a teacher, never found any lessons more engaging than when we would get into reading books and memoirs and speaker testimony, et cetera, related to the Holocaust. Whether I was teaching all Mexican-American kids, African-American kids, whatever demographic of kids, refugee kids, kids from other countries of genocide, suddenly they found something that talked to them about their lives and about responsibility and being challenged essentially to being a young person growing up in this world and trying to make sense of who you are, that identity empathy piece, right? And so with that engagement comes this sort of additional responsibility that we hope that through our resources and lessons, the teachers are able to teach consistent with the intent. And that is to convey this understanding that teaching about the Holocaust is by no means just teaching about what happened to over 6 million Jews during the Holocaust, but rather it can be used successfully and is being used successfully by so many teachers as a platform into teaching to combat all forms of hatred, racism, prejudice, etc. So absolutely anti-Semitism and Jewish history and persecution is key and part and parcel of this instruction. But it's important that it's not ever siloed away in this sort of space that, oh yeah, that's those people there, that's this part of history there. Rather, we see from the fact that genocides have and continue to occur in present day, that there's so much, we have so much work to do, frankly. I don't know a better way of saying it. And so we fight this fight in this hope of trying to sort of like light candles amongst all the students we reach, all the teachers we reach, so that more of us can understand the dangers of where hatred can and sadly too often does lead. Okay, so what does this look like? So our best practices come down to this. It's on our website here. It's also through OSPI's website, and you can access them here. And as I indicated, they're diverse enough that they have everything from proposed outlines for teaching, so that if you're teaching 8th grade ELA or 11th grade history, and you looked at this and said, oh man, this is awesome. You have so many great things here, from overviews to resources and articles and lessons that are really plug and play. But my needs are such that I can't make choices right now, and I just only have 3 weeks or whatever. And so some teachers, when we were creating these, say, can you just create kind of like proposed outlines? Like, what would you do if you only had 3 weeks? And so we have everything hyperlinked that you can just take, use, with explanations and supporting context for you every step of the way. And what it really comes down to, you see this image here. So I want to key in on this graphic because I use this a lot in the many presentations I do to school districts across the state. In fact, this evening, I'm going to be presenting to over 80 educators in the Vancouver School District who are just really excited, and that's K-12, just really excited about learning what is there? How might this inform how I teach about empathy, civic understanding, and responsibility in my classroom at whatever grade level? And so I like to really key in on this because I'm a visual learner, and this helps me, and I know it always helps so many of my students. So you can see that it's not until step 4, right? Step 4, 3 things that we're recommending strongly that need to be achieved or done before jumping into lessons related to, okay, now we're going to read Night, or we're going to read Mouse, or we're going to read a graphic novel, whatever. Before you get to that, or to teach lessons in history, America's response to the Holocaust, other genocides, etc., we strongly urge that educators consider and do essentially these 3 things. First is to consider what the guidelines are for teaching. To many of you here, maybe some of you have been teaching related to the Holocaust for some years. You're like, I don't know, well, what could go wrong? Well, a lot. I'll give you 3 quick examples of things that I've seen in my sort of travels working with teachers. There are some sort of, in some case, namely, one of the key things that is sort of would lead people asunder is where one would delve into lessons related to the Holocaust, such as or reading, let's say, Night, without any historical context. Think about it. If you were teaching To Kill a Mockingbird, or if you were teaching Shakespeare, you would never jump straight into the text. That would be teacher malpractice, in my estimation and opinion. You really need to sort of set your students up for success, right? So that what are your objectives? What do you hope and want and expect them to learn through this? And they're not going to really fully appreciate the totality of this and their role, hopefully, within the learning unless they understand the context, that which preceded it. And you can see contextually here, we have lessons. All of these are sort of hyperlinked here from our film that we've created called Survivor Voices, which is about a 25-minute long film that educators are really raving about, because in one fell swoop, teachers and students are able to understand a little bit about what the Holocaust was, why it matters today, and they're introduced into survivors, that personal story element that Ilana alluded to earlier. In addition, there are lessons here, timeline activity, all of these things teachers can make choices based on the time that they have available. Anytime you have a question or would like additional help or counseling, feel free to email me, and I'm absolutely happy to help any educator who would like to sort of, talk about these things. And then another part of it here is this real importance about establishing, because again, so many of my students that I've taught in the past, in fact, the vast majority, who are Jewish people? What is Judaism? How is it different from Christianity or Islam, et cetera, et cetera? So making sure that students understand that, as Akiva mentioned earlier, that Jews didn't appear in the face of the world as persecuted people in 1933 when Hitler came into power, but rather Jews had lived for centuries in Europe, were very successful and lived in diverse communities from poor to wealthy, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, varying in degrees of assimilation, et cetera, et cetera. But it's really important that we introduce this sort of essence of Jewish life before we delve into learning about them and how and why they were victimized. So anti-Semitism is a part of it. And I'm going to show you really quickly here. I'd like to show this to you just a second here, in how in really just in two and a half minutes, you can achieve so much. So I'm going to just go right to this part here. This is from a lesson that we sort of developed here, where in lesson 1 class period, teaching or introducing students to Jews, who Jews are, and Jewish life in Europe based on maps, engaging them with what do you know, what do you want to know, and then leading over to this particular short film here that's just 4.5 minutes long. So I'm going to show you here just the last 2.5 minutes. And what I'm going to prompt you with here is a question that I always ask students, and I encourage teachers to ask, because this is part of this lesson. So I'd say, I'll talk to you like I would as if you were my students right now. And I'd say, okay, I'm going to now that we're learning a little bit about Jews and where they lived and how many there were in various places and things in Europe, I'm now going to show you this sort of excerpt from a film. It'll just take 2.5 minutes. And I'd like to ask you to think about, while you're writing down what you notice and what you wonder while you're watching this short film, I'd like you to think about, why am I showing it to you? Why do you think your teacher, Mr. R, right now is taking up class time to show this? What do you think that I hope you learn as a result of watching it? So here it is here.
The work at school is finished. The days are sunny and warm. Our schoolmates dream about green fields, about the cheerful camp life. Never did life possess such joy and freedom from care.
It seems one does everything but pray. The girls talk and look down at the boys, and the boys talk and look up at the girls. This is what the entire thing consists of.
I hated porridge. No matter how much butter and sugar was added, I couldn't stand the look of the gluey mass.
We had a Hanukkah play. I was one of the candles, supposedly of a menorah, and we all had a verse that we had to recite in Hebrew, and it was a very exciting thing to me.
My mother was meticulous about keeping kosher and prayed 3 times a day, even though she was a modern woman who read literature and spoke several languages.
I frequently imagine myself as a great ice skating dancer performing for large audiences.
When I went to shul, I made sure not to miss even one single word. This is how precious the Hebrew words were to me.
Spring, warm and gentle, brings a beautiful holiday of freedom.
Passover. I have the job of cleaning our windows for the holiday.
In my dreams, I am a great poet, beautiful, talented, and very famous. My poems open the secret heart of the world, and its embrace carries me far away. With eyes closed, I lie for hours and daydream. Life is a mystery to me, a beautiful, secret mystery.
Okay, so then I would return and I would prompt you then with the question. Okay, so think about what I asked you beforehand, and I'd love to see if you can type into chat your response. And my question was, or is now, is why do you think that I showed this to you? What do you believe that I hope that my students learn as a result of seeing this 2-minute clip? Go ahead and type your response into chat. Absolutely. Thank you. Right? Think about that. Yes, that they're just like us. They are the same. It helps to humanize the Jews. And this is so key. I've had students from the Middle East. I've had African-American students, people who didn't understand that Jesus was a Jew. This in one fell swoop immediately creates a connection. It immediately creates a point of understanding, a hopeful intent across social emotional learning to achieve that empathy that we desire. In just 2.5 minutes, think about how much we achieved here as a result of this lesson and a little bit about what Judaism is and how it relates and contrasts to Christianity. Immediately now, our students' minds, with a little bit of the other context that we recommend there, are sort of ready. They're eager to now delve into whatever reading they're going to go into, or a speaker presentation like you're going to get to see the amazing Carla Pepperzak speak with you and her daughters and Julia later today. So this is the point, right? We want to make sure we set the table so that people can adequately and appropriately engage with what we hope they were going to learn. And what I'm referring to there, or alluding to, is really the rationale piece. And rationale is key. Our single best recommendation and our most popular lesson, really, in terms of all of my presentations to teachers and what I did with my students, is our pyramid of hate activity. And this pyramid of hate looks like, let's see, where is it here? Yes, there it is. That is an image of the pyramid of hate. The pyramid of hate itself was a tool developed by the ADL some years ago. And right from the beginning, this is a lesson that now we've adapted. Teachers can utilize this lesson in 2.5 class periods tops. And oh my gosh, the results that you would achieve from this investment in setting the table. Because immediately, right, remember, we hope, Akiva referenced this earlier, but we hope too, that in everything we do, why are we teaching about the Holocaust? What do we hope our students will learn? Among many things, one of the key ones is we hope that all students learn the dangers of where hatred can and does lead when too few people do anything about it when they see it in front of them. So what does that mean, right? So we first asked them to look at this image here, okay, and then consider. And then I'd be quiet and I'd ask them to turn and talk after they've looked at it for a while and say, how do you think that these layers, or whatever you want to call them, in this triangle or pyramid, how do they relate to one another and why? So students would take their time and they'd scratch their heads. And after they turn and talk, invariably, they'd all say, well, they all are really bad, but it seems to get worse the higher up you go. And then there are usually questions like, just because you have these things, does it always mean that you're going to lead up to genocide? And it's really important to point out that the answer to that is absolutely not. But sadly, we do know that it does, that it can, right? It's a potential escalation. Do these things have to happen in their order? No, they happen out of order often. However, usually, if you think about it, for something to be discrimination or bias-motivated violence, it's not coming from nowhere. Genocide does not come like that. Hitler and the Nazis didn't step in and instantly begin genocide. In Rwanda, what happened in 1994 sat atop decades-long hatred, prejudice, and discrimination introduced by Belgium, of all countries, sitting atop their policy of eugenics towards a certain group of people, the Hutu in Rwanda. And so by the time an accident happened in April 6, 1994, the Hutu took advantage of all of these things and the hatred and the us versus them, and genocide became possible because hatred was normalized in their society. It became an accepted part of the everyday, and nobody did anything about it. And so by the end of the lesson, right, we try to engage the students. We use primary sources, including video clips, including images that teachers have found so much value in as they ask students to consider which layer or layers of the pyramid are impacted when we look at this video. Why? What's your evidence to support it? And by the end of it, then they can get pretty bonked down with this idea of like, oh my gosh, this is awful, because all these things we're seeing from history seem to still be happening in our world today. Where are we? What hope is there? And so the last part of the lesson really engages the students with the idea of, let's talk about what preventative strategies there are. What can we do realistically about this? And so, to make a very long story short, to be mindful of our time here, I want to convey that one of the biggest keys here, as they consider and they talk, and there's a real incredible, vibrant conversation in class, as they're considering what, if anything, little old me can do to stop these things, they realize that if there is any power, any sense of agency, that the chances for little old me to do something are much greater if I act in response to biased attitudes and acts of bias, because these are things that happen around me in my school hallways, in my community, maybe, God forbid, at home sometimes, that you see these things play out. But the higher up it goes, an individual sees that, well, it's not impossible to combat discrimination because we have examples of protests and organized movements and groups and organizations to combat such things, but it's a lot more work. And so the ultimate learning that is vested and that we try to encourage our students to consider is that we can't turn a blind eye to hatred, to prejudice, to bullying, to discrimination. We can't turn a blind eye. We have to speak up. We have to use our voice. And when students feel that sense of, I understand these dangers, I see it, and these are things that I absolutely, hopefully, will be more likely to do as a result of this, as a result of now that I've learned this. So that's kind of a real nutshell overview. We have so many incredible things. You're going to get to see, like I say, you're going to get to meet a member of our Speakers Bureau in Carla Pepperzak very shortly. We have, as was alluded to earlier by Ilana, the field trips. We have Speakers Bureau. All these things are free resources you can request. And we offer professional development. Just like I mentioned earlier, I'll be presenting later to the Vancouver School District. We work very closely with many districts across the state, and I give or adapt various presentations in different time increments. We're also planning to introduce asynchronous options as well to make sure that we accommodate equitably teacher schedules and challenges. But any and all of these things are helping us, right, to sort of fulfill the mission of the legislation, which is to help more teachers be and feel successful in helping their students achieve the desired outcomes of why teach related to the Holocaust and its connectivity to hate, racism, etc., in all of their forms still today. So that sort of concludes my portion. I'll be happy. I'll take a look at chat if there are any questions and things. I'll try to address those once we pause. But Akiva, I guess I'll turn it back over to you because I think we were going to take a quick brief break before we come in with Carla, correct?
That's correct. So thank you so much, Paul. I just always love hearing from you, and you do such a good job of encapsulating the work and introducing people to the pyramid of hate, all these things. So we'll get some links there in the chat a little bit later, but we're going to take a break, just like Paul was saying, for 5 minutes. So we're going to come back at 12:35, and then we'll hear from Carla Pepperzak, her two daughters, in conversation with Julia. So we'll take a quick break, and we'll be back at 12:35. Thank you. All right, everybody, it's 12:35. I'm going to resume the recording. All right, I'm going to welcome now Julia Thompson from the Holocaust Center for Humanity to initiate our next portion of the presentation with Carla Pepperzak and her two daughters. Good afternoon, Julia.
Hi, Akiva. Thank you so much for including me in this program, and a big thanks to all the educators who have joined us from across the state. I'm going to be moderating our conversation this afternoon for the next roughly 45 minutes before we have some Q&A time. And I'm going to be joined by three wonderful women who I'll introduce briefly. And thank you. I see videos turning on, which is perfect. So today we have three individuals with us, as you know, from Akiva's prior introduction. I'll introduce them one by one, and then we'll get started. Carla Pepperzak. As you already heard, Carla is a Jewish Holocaust survivor who is also part of the Dutch resistance and is currently a member of the Holocaust Center for Humanity Speakers Bureau. Carla was a teenager in 1940 when Nazi Germany invaded her home country of the Netherlands. We will hear pieces of her experiences during World War II in our conversation today and how it has continued to affect her life. Carla trained as a medical technologist and after the war married her husband Paul in 1948. The two started a family and moved all over the world to Kenya, Thailand, Liberia, Hawaii, and other US states due to Paul's career with the United Nations and the World Bank. Carla moved to Spokane, Washington in 2004, where she has resided ever since and is an integral member of the community, especially as an advocate for Holocaust education. Carla was named Washingtonian of the Year in 2020, and recently Carla's legacy was honored by the Spokane Public Schools as she is the namesake of the future Carla Ullman Pepperzak Middle School, which is opening in the fall of 2023. Carla is also scheduled to receive an honorary doctorate from Gonzaga University in a couple of weeks. And Marian Cummings. Marian is the oldest daughter of Carla Pepperzak, the second of four children. Marian and her husband lived in Spokane for 43 years prior to moving to the Sandpoint, Idaho area 18 months ago. They raised two daughters in Spokane and are now blessed with their two families, which include 5 grandchildren. Marian was trained as a chemist, but spent much of her career working part-time in the field of bookkeeping and taxes. She feels that her true career has been to serve as a volunteer on multiple boards and committees. Now retired, Marian continues to give her time to help with transportation, tech needs, and moral support with Carla when she shares her story. And finally, Yvonne Pepperzak Blake. Yvonne is the youngest child and daughter of Carla. Yvonne grew up around the world, and after graduation with a nursing degree from Georgetown University, she moved to Gallup, New Mexico, where she lived for 40 years. Yvonne worked there for the Indian Health Service, Navajo Nation, the Zuni tribe, and the local hospital, which included a live call-in radio show. Yvonne is married with 2 children, and she retired in 2017 and now lives in Colorado. She stays busy with numerous clubs, her 3 granddaughters, and traveling. So I truly can't express my gratitude to all 3 of you for joining me today to talk about your experience, Carla, its echoes, its impact, its legacy on Yvonne and Marian, and so many of us. I've had the pleasure to know you, Carla, for almost 7 years, I think, and this is the first time that I've been able to have a conversation with you and both of your daughters and share it with the attendees. So I'm just so excited to get into some topics regarding your history and how it affects us today. I want to encourage attendees to put questions or thoughts into the Q&A box because we will get to those. But first, Carla, I just want to start by talking a little bit about your experience when you were younger. And first of all, if you can share with us when and where you were born, and maybe a bit about your childhood, your family?
Thank you for the introduction, and good morning or for afternoon, people. I was born in 1923 and raised and born in Amsterdam. I had only one sister who was a year older than myself. Excuse me, she doesn't live anymore, she passed away. I had a very happy childhood, just two of us, but I enjoyed school very much when I got a bit older. And I did like sports, especially all the water sports. One of them was rowing, but actually did ice skating and swimming. And I still am swimming. So, you know, I'm 98 years old now. So I was 16 when the Nazis invaded the Netherlands. And the life at the first did not change too much. By the way, they invaded in May, so school vacation was soon after that. But in the beginning, it wasn't changed much, and I could continue doing what we were doing. Though, of course, we were very concerned what was happening. And just a couple of months later, the Nazis started with the different restrictions on the Jewish people. One of the first ones was that every Jewish person had to register. And there were about, in the Netherlands, 158,000 people registered. And by the way, the Netherlands, percentage-wise, lost most Jewish people of all of Europe. You know, there were not that many in Holland, but after the war, 25,000 were left.
Carla, before we talk a little bit more about the war years, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share about your faith or your religion before the war. Did you practice Judaism?
Excuse me, this is terrible. Excuse me, I saw that. Can you hear me?
Okay on your end?
Well,
yeah, we can still hear you.
I have to rejoin. Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay.
We can hear you, we can see you.
All right, let's go back
all is well
for a moment. You want me to share what?
Oh, I was wondering if you could share anything about your Jewish faith or religious practices that you experienced before the war.
They'll come up later. And my mother was not Jewish, but we still have a Jewish household because, you know, when she was 18, she was taken up in a Jewish family. And I did go to a Reformed temple and had Jewish and Hebrew lessons. And actually, the same temple, I met Anne Frank and her sister Margaret.
Right.
And Margaret was only a year younger than I am, so I had more contact with her than with Anne, except for the fact that we were in some stage plays together, and was in there too. And we did not really become real friends, but you know, we saw each other every week, and I have been in their home, and what I most was the heavy furniture because they came from a big house in Germany and were living in an apartment.
Right.
But they also lived only a block and a half away from me. So we did, you know, see each other in stores and so on. And I did not play with them, as you know, but I did see them quite often.
Mm-hmm. That's something that students really latch on to, don't you think? The story of Anne Frank, and knowing that you actually knew that family, that's really incredible to hear about.
It's amazing. There is one thing I want to mention. There is recently a book published, The Betrayal of Anne Frank. That book has been withdrawn in the Netherlands. The first thing when I heard about it, I couldn't believe what the results were. And I guess I was correct. I just want to teach to know this, that don't teach the book out of the book Betrayal of Anne Frank.
That's right. It recently came out supposedly revealing someone who betrayed the Frank family, but in fact has been widely discredited since by historians. So yeah, thank you for adding that. So in any case, I'm sorry, Carla, you were speaking about how things changed once the Nazis invaded the Netherlands and maybe things progressed. And if you could spend a few minutes on your involvement in the resistance.
Well, that came about later. Like I said, first wasn't too bad, and but the different measurements started. And in 1941, everybody needed everybody, even over 15 years old, Jewish and non-Jewish people, an ID. And the Jewish people's identification card had a J next to their picture, and so it wasn't mine, of course. And my father, because of my mother not being, born Jewish, racial Jewish, I would say, did go to an attorney and worked with that attorney, and I got a new identification card. It took about a year to take care of that, but that changed my life completely, because all of a sudden I didn't have to wear the star, and I got the same freedom as the regular Dutch people did. So in that way, I could go three-car train, bus, the restrictions. I didn't have to worry about the restrictions anymore.
So I'm sharing this image of an ID of yours from 1942. So this would be an example of basically you were passing as non-Jewish because there's no J on this ID.
Right, there was no. But of course, I could have been betrayed anyhow. But anyhow, I did get an uncle of mine asked me to see if I could help to get them into hiding. And I found the right person to help me along with that, and we found a hiding place for him. And him and his family and his wife and two very young children. And I got them into hiding. And that's how I really got to know got to be part of the underground or the resistance movement, because I needed the help. When people went into hiding, they used to give them a new ID, because the ID with a J was terrible if you to have. So England, we got IDs, and I learned how to make the new IDs, the false IDs actually. And I made about 100 over the years. And that was quite a story. There's one little story about that I was being interrogated one time. I carried the false IDs and the printing, you needed from a printer, or not a printer, but to make you some prints and the information, all that in a little suitcase. And when I was being interrogated, I passed. Not a flirt, but I flirted with them. And it was two Nazi officers. And when I passed apparently, because they didn't take me in. And when they left, I had to leave, and I was carrying this little suitcase, and one of them was very polite and said, "Let me carry it for you." And of course, I was really very fearful at that moment, because if they had opened it, or if it had fallen open, I would not be sitting here. But that's one of the stories that happened. But so from one thing came another, and I was able to help about 40 people to go into hiding. And fortunately, they all lived after the war.
Mm-hmm. Which is, that's incredible.
And I have a photo for them. Yeah. I got involved with, nobody had radios anymore. We had newspapers, but the newspapers were all very much from the German point of view. So we did not get international. Oh, by the way, this picture is from my uncle's two little girls, the one who went into hiding. And I don't know if there's time, I can tell you the story on this. It's rather interesting. The two little ones we could not keep in the place their parents were, because a little 2.5 and a 5 or 4 or 5 years old, you cannot keep them hiding and not being able to go outside. So we found foster homes basically for them. And the older one was moved from one home to another, but they did not let me know that that had happened. So after the war, when the parents were freed, and the little one we could find right away, but the older one we couldn't. And I was asked to help them to find her in the same in the area where she was originally. I asked a Canadian officer with a jeep to take me there, so we may go able to trace her. And when immediately after the war, there was very little food, and then a Canadian jeep stopped, and the little kids would go around the jeep, and I'd ask candy, and they usually got candy and chocolate, and it was just wonderful. And here we were stopped in the area where we thought she would be, and one little girl looked at me and she said, "Carla." She recognized me. So actually she found me, but we found her. And I was in Holland, many, many years later. And here they are, the two little girls, and they're fortunately still alive. And I really, once in a while, I have contact with them, not much. That's the story.
The family was reunited in part thanks to you,
Absolutely.
and being able to stay in touch over those decades is also quite amazing.
Yeah.
Well,
I
go
was
ahead.
involved with the printing of, I meant about a newspaper, about we would print a sheet of the Allied news and would mimeograph that and pass it on to people so they knew what the news was, because like I said, all radios were confiscated and nobody could get news from all the. We had a radio and we listened to it in the closet. So every afternoon at 6 o'clock.
Right. So risking your safety in your life to not only forge those false IDs, but distributing real factual news, right, instead of the propaganda.
Yeah, well, the propaganda was amazing, and I think that's why so many German people were helping the government and the Jewish people, and so many people died. The result was terrible. And in the meantime, during this time, it was really very frightening. Everything you did, you did not know if you would be caught and be picked up and so on. But fortunately, I lived through this, and I could.
Well, thank you, Carla. I know that we could spend much more time hearing stories about those years under the Nazi occupation, but I want to also turn to Marian and Yvonne, of course, and perhaps get some reactions from the two of you about when you first learned about your mother's Holocaust experiences. Either one of you can begin. When did you first learn about it? How did you feel? What was that like?
I'll go first, given I'm the oldest, right, Yvonne? Growing up, we knew my mother had been involved in World War II, and I think we eventually found out that she was involved in the resistance as well, but it was a taboo subject. We were never allowed to ask questions or bring the subject up, other than we knew she had some sort of involvement and knew the Frank family. Fast forward to the early 1990s, and my mother was coming for Mother's Day weekend to Spokane. I had a daughter who at the time was in 6th grade and was studying Anne Frank, and she comes home one day from school and says, "Do you think Oma," which is what they call her, would talk to my class about her experiences and knowing Anne Frank? And I said, I've always been told I can't ask her, so that's up to you. You can call and talk to her, which she did. And my mother thought about it for a few days, and then she said yes. And I still have a little cassette somewhere of the recording I made of her talking to that class way back then and learning all kinds of things I had no clue about. And the fact that she had these artifacts in hand too, that what possessed her to save them, but she did. And I was just flabbergasted. I was in awe. And then again, she didn't speak. And when I think about a year or two later, she spoke at a school in Colorado Springs where she was living at the time. And I did come down and accompany her to that. And from that, once she moved to Spokane and got very active on the speakers tour, I have been involved ever since.
Yvonne, anything to add about your
I would say,
or different?
No, I think Marian and Megan, Marian's daughter, is the one who started the conversation. But I know when I was, I don't know, 10, 11, 12, we traveled all around the world, and we always did that with trunks. So everything was kept in trunks, and we had trunks out throughout the house with mothball smells in them, because everywhere we traveled, we had mothball smells. And I went to, this is a ridiculous story, and thank goodness I can't see anybody listening to this, I said, Mom, I think I need a bra, because I went to this water fight in California. So you're talking 60s. And so she says, well, let's go to the trunk and get you a bra. And she opened it up, and I saw her Star of David. And I said, what is this? And I'm pulling it out. And she said, put that back. We don't discuss it. And so then that was quiet for about 40 years. And then it wasn't until I think her official talk to the whole family was on her 80th birthday in Colorado Springs. And she gathered all 42 of us at the time, I think we're now more than 50, and gave a conversation and said, I need to tell the family the story. So that's really my first one-on-one experience of hearing the story.
Wow. So amazing that you took the opportunity, Carla, eventually to gather your whole family, several generations, and kind of share for the first time. I hadn't heard that before. If you're willing to share, Carla, how was that experience for you, sharing with your family?
I think I was a bit nervous about this, but I thought it was time to do it. And I really don't quite remember it all. I mean, I remember talking to them, and I remember where I was standing, but my own reaction was, hey, it's about time. It's more than that for me. I lost my very close uncles, aunts, and nephews, and nieces, and at the time, our cousins. And I realized that it's terribly important that they are not forgotten. And that's probably the reason that I talked about it. So I feel in this way, I remember the blessed memory, and I think this is terribly important for me. And I think that probably was one of the very personal reasons. Another reason, of course, was that they were old enough, because, and even the grandchildren, that it's time that they know my story.
Yeah, thank you for that. And let's talk a little bit more about sort of this passing of the legacy, to younger generations. Marian, I know you've been involved quite deeply with your mom and making presentations. Can you share with us what that has been like? Have you learned more? Visiting schools together? Describe that a little bit.
Okay. I would say I really felt the true impact, and this was probably, Mom, how long ago do you think you started speaking? 12 years ago? Something like that?
At least probably.
And this had to be within the first year or two. We were out at North Idaho College, and my mother's presentation has become a little more elaborate and formatted since then. But at that time, we were at North Idaho College prior to the showing of the play, The Diary of Anne Frank. And the audience was invited to come and attend my mother's presentation prior to the play. And the audience at that time was also allowed to handle the artifacts. They were passed around in the circle. There had to be maybe 40 people there, 45 people. And at the end of it, several people came up on stage where my mom was talking. This is Halloween. And there was an 11-year-old girl who came up and said, I gave up Halloween because I thought this was more important than collecting candy. And can I touch you? And that was very, very moving. And I have to admit, almost every time my mother gives a presentation, God knows how many of them I have gone to, there's always a little twinge of the tear in the back of the eye going, wow.
Mm-hmm.
It's remarkable that she still does it. She's driven to do it now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think she'll keep on kicking and doing it for years to come, even though she's 98.
Don't know how you live years.
But you better, because I'm not sure I want to step in and do it just yet.
The very first time I talked in the school in Colorado Springs was also because they wanted me to talk to the cast of the Anne Frank play.
Mm.
So that's
right.
I still cannot see the play itself, so I never go. It's very difficult even to wish to see movies or to see pictures from that time. So I try to avoid it. Reading is okay.
Yeah. Yvonne, anything you'd like to add? I know you've worked with your mom a few times presenting.
I definitely don't do as good a job as Marian. My personal experience with helping my mom, I don't get the slides out right, but I think what came out of all this, and when my dad passed away, is we asked all the kids to, grandkids and children, to ask my mom questions. So they wrote up questions and she started handwriting all the answers on a sheet of paper, on a yellow sheet of paper. And I said, Mom, we need to start typing this up. And so for her 95th birthday, we got it done. We got this book done. So I got to ask lots and lots of questions, and I would recommend to any teacher to do this with families is write down those questions and have them answer the questions and put it into a book. And I just so happened to have the book right here. But it's a gift to the next generation. And I know many people want more stories about the Holocaust, but just the stories, to be able to share those for future generations, I think is very important. And one other story, and Marian and Mom can talk about this a little bit more, but I know there was a shooting in a high school in Spokane. And after her conversation with these kids, apparently the reaction of the kids during the shooting was they actually took care of each other. And people think this is a result of her having given a talk about respect and honoring each other. And maybe Marian and Mom can elaborate on what happened there, but I know that was a reaction to a conversation that my mom gave.
Right. Yeah, that was a
Freeman High School.
Exactly. A very tragic event at Freeman High School where Carla had visited not all that long before. I think we have some video and images from at the Holocaust Center from that visit. So absolutely. Well, let's see. We've still got plenty of time. Kind of on that same vein of perhaps memorable speaking experiences. Carla, do you have anything that stands out as maybe a favorite visit you've made or a particularly impactful presentation with students?
The number one for me is that how well are the students prepared for this, for my talk. And I had one experience which was was really very difficult. The students were not prepared, and on top of it, it was in the gymnasium, and this was near lunchtime, and every 7 minutes to 10 minutes, a very loud bell rang, and I had to stop talking. And I'll never forget that because it was sort of a disaster.
Oh no! Yeah.
And another time which was difficult was the Zoom time with a middle school here in town, and we had the wrong PowerPoint for the computer we used. It was an Apple. I have an HP computer, and it was an Apple computer. Anyhow, all the pictures were upside down or sideways, and the Holocaust Center helped me, except they had different pictures from what I was talking about. So there was also very a different situation. I think what Marian touched upon is very true. Of course, some don't particularly care too much and don't listen all that well, but some, and always I'm very grateful those kids I can reach, that they understand what's going on. And I don't know how many letters, and I saved them all from after talking in schools, and I got thank you notes from the students, and I really appreciate it. It's just wonderful to have them. And like I said, I save them. I don't know what I should do with them eventually, but the touching, reaching the students, that they understand what's going on, is really very, very important to me. And that's what it's all about, of course. Let's face it. But and I hope that the students will talking about it to other kids, etc. It's very
right.
Yeah. That's
and who knows how many students you've reached by now? Countless, thousands,
no idea.
Thousands.
Quite a few. And talking just a bit, going back to the name of the middle school. This is in South Hill, in Spokane, and of course I couldn't believe that this was happening, and I still have a hard time. The only the way I look at it, if people see the name and say, "Now, where does that name come from? What does that person have to? What did she do with? Why is the school name?" And after her, and I think that's to me the very important part. That then they talk about the Holocaust, and I hope the school itself will have videos and programs to, for the kids every time to be able to talk about the Holocaust and understand what's going on, and hope we can, avoid hates and that,
Yes, the school name can be a catalyst for their learning. And I'm hoping my screen share works, but I wanted to show this really great photo of you, Carla, on the right, on that day of the groundbreaking. This was in March.
And on the left is Andre Watts, the new principal. And I just got an email from him yesterday that they are working now on the name of a mascot. And there are 5 feeder schools into the school, and he is going to every one of them and let the students choose a name
for the mascot.
If I had a name in mind, and I mentioned lions, because the weapon of Amsterdam and the weapon of the Netherlands all have the lion in it, and the Lion of Judah. So I thought that was appropriate, but the students may not think that way.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to ask you what was maybe a Dutch connection to some type of mascot. So I think that sounds perfect, but we will see.
Right.
Let's see. Well, we have, of course, a captive audience of teachers here with us today. We have almost 100 teachers. And Carla, you mentioned a little bit, you know, how wonderful it is when students are prepared before you share your story, if maybe they have done a little bit of Holocaust education already, which Paul and Akiva and Ilana all spoke about. And yeah, I just wonder, Carla, if there's anything you want these educators to know about the Holocaust or about teaching the Holocaust.
I know it's a very difficult subject. You know, every time I talk, I feel at the end of the talk that I'm not satisfied. And the reason I'm not satisfied is that it's very difficult to convey what really happened, how you felt, the angst and the worry and the fear and the hunger, how difficult it is if you have to go through it before you really know. And so it's not an easy subject, and there's so much written now about it, which is good. But I can see how, how one has to find their way in between. And I think the center is doing a terrific job by guiding the teachers and giving the guidelines they do. So hopefully, that the teachers can make use of it. Not every teacher knows about it. And I don't know how because I find that in school, and I mention it to them about the program you have, and they have never heard of it. So I do not know. I think teachers themselves can talk about this and mention it to other teachers that this exists, and that for them to help. And it's so terribly important because, and I think that was touched upon this morning very much already, about the hatred and the genocide which can follow out of that, and how you can avoid it. And it's not easy to avoid, but you can teach the child. And I always like to use the word respect. I think it's if a person can have respect for another person, then those things can't happen. And respect should be taught at home, but it not always is. And I think if the teachers can teach respect is very important to me. So that's my observation for the teachers. Like I said, I'm very grateful that they do teach it, and that so many people are interested, because I think it's terribly important, simply because, Germany in those years was really probably the most cultural and educated society in Western Europe. And it still happened. And it happened because when the Nazis got into power, they had the propaganda was amazing. It was scientifically probably the best propaganda they ever did. And that was against Jews. So many of the people who, probably never cared one way or another, became anti-Semitic because of this propaganda. And that, of course, is one of the things one has to fight against, and it can happen anywhere. Let's say here on all the Facebook and all that Twitter and whatever. People can be made to believe things. We have to fight that.
I'd like to turn. Thank you, Carla, so much. I want to turn to Yvonne and Marian as well. And the two of you not only are the daughters of a survivor and a resistor, but your parents, grandparents of students who went through school. What do you hope that students today might learn from studying the Holocaust?
Never again, as Mom always says. We need to, and the bottom line is the word my mother always ends her presentations with, and that is respect. If we have respect for every human, we don't have to like that human, but we have to respect them for their humanity and what is good in them. There is good in everyone. And if we can maintain that and keep it in perspective, then perhaps genocide will end.
Thanks, Marian. Yvonne?
I agree 100% ditto, but I also think it's like the movie Paul showed earlier, that all humans want the same thing. We want peace, respect. We want our families to be well and healthy. And if we tolerate and understand each other, that we may be a little bit different in the way we grew up and our cultures are a little bit different, we, at the end of the day, all want the same thing, which is peace, love, and respect. And if you can understand that, then I always say I love to travel, because at the end of the day, whether you're in Vietnam or Africa or in Europe, we all want the same thing. And that's to have a good life for our family, our friends, and the world. We just want peace. And if we can respect each other, we can get there and understand each other. So I think Holocaust teaching may have people understand what people have gone through. And let's move forward from this. It's kind of happening in Ukraine right now. So.
Well, thank you. Well, before we move into some questions, because I know we've got a few from the audience already, the four of us talked several weeks ago about the fact that some people consider Carla to be a hero. She doesn't necessarily think of herself in that term, but you know, she did some incredible things. We talk at the Holocaust Center about upstanders, people being an upstander and speaking up and taking action instead of being a bystander. So I wanted to ask all three of you if there are any heroes or upstanders who you look up to now. Anyone doing, you know, incredible work in the world around you or in your community. Do any of you want to share?
Let me say, I have been thinking about that a lot. I really have a tremendous, I'm talking about respect, but for teachers. It is such a difficult job, and giving so much from yourself to the students. I mean, I think they're probably, you know, very underappreciated, but my respect for them is amazing. So one of the things. So I don't have an individual that I can say that, unless you talk about politics and you're talking about Mr. Zelensky, which who does an enormous job, but that's politics, and I don't want to go into that. But my personal thing, you know, there are so many people around us who are really very good people and who give from themselves more than is expected. And all those people, you know, I admire. So it's not only one person, but it is many people I admire. Like Marian said, there is so much good in people. So that's my observation. Sorry.
I love that. Yeah, Yvonne or Marian?
Marian, I'll let you go first.
Okay.
I always tell her age before
sibling,
It's funny, when I read the little prompts that Julia had sent out, of course, my instant reaction was, okay, mom is number one, who would be number two? And teachers came to mind. And immediately with that, I thought of my son-in-law. He is a teacher, but he is primarily a football coach for the high school here. He's the head football coach. And I've only lived here 18 months, but in that time, I have run into 5 people who, as the conversation progresses, realize that I am the mother-in-law of this man, and they start crying, explaining to me the difference that man has made in their child's life. What my son-in-law tries to do, we, in Sandpoint, we have the very wealthy all the way down to the survivalists, the dirt poor, the people who live off grid. And as a result, with his football team, he's got 67 players. He tries to equalize the playing field for all of them. He fundraises quietly. Every boy has the same shoes as the next guy, the same clothing, the backpack, the coats, the school books, the help in tutoring, meals. During football season, he feeds them 3 meals a day. And just emotional support if they live off grid with a family who has no desire to keep up with them. He finds them a home in town to live in. I mean, that is going way above the call of duty, and the difference he's made in lives is incredible. And I feel all teachers do that. I just happen to know my son-in-law the best.
I would have to agree. And of course, I think if you look at who your hero is, I think it's anybody who is living actually selflessly. And I think Mom and Marian just described humans who live selflessly, are willing to give of themselves, even at a cost to themselves. And I know you had asked us, Julia, earlier, give us a name. And I was thinking of Malala, the young lady, Yousafzai, never mind her last name, the Nobel Peace Prize, willing to give your life. And Mom did the same thing as a young woman, where you're willing to live selflessly for the greater community. And that to me is anyone who does that. And that definitely is healthcare providers today, as well as teachers. So I agree. You can't really focus on one person.
Yeah, well, thank you all. I couldn't agree more that instead of focusing on, who's the individual, but it's, everyone, groups of people, communities, spreading goodness and respect. And I think all of you just put forward amazing responses to that prompt. And of course, celebrating and honoring teachers is crucial. And so all of you who are listening, we thank you. We honor you, and you're doing amazing things. So in the time that we have left, which is a little under 10 minutes, we do have some great questions to discuss, and feel free to keep adding them. I want to thank you for those contributions. The first question I see, I think all three of you could probably address, from Elaine, is whether you've returned to your home of origin. Have you been in the Netherlands before?
After we waited until we got our US citizenship, because we did not really want to leave the country. We immigrated in 1953 from actually West Africa. And then 5 years later, we could become US citizens. By that time, we lived in Hawaii. And then we went back to Holland almost every year. So until my sister passed away, the last time now was in 2017. And I don't see of going there anymore.
And Yvonne and Marian, how do you feel visiting the Netherlands? What kind of experiences have you had spending time there?
I go fairly frequently. One of my best friend is my cousin who lives in Holland still, and it's been 2 years since I've been there, mainly because of COVID. But backing up a little bit further to my mother's sister, prior to her dying, I remember sitting with her in the hospice house, telling her that my true home, the place that felt most like home physically to me, was her apartment in Amsterdam, because that was always a constant in my life. She lived there from before I was born until she passed away. And I always knew every time we went to Holland, that's where I stayed, was at her house for the most part. And yeah, going to Holland is like going home, always.
Oh, nice. Yvonne, anything to add, or?
No, I would agree. I don't know if Marian, of course, is older than I am. So she had a different experience than I did. And so no one would think so. Everybody thinks I'm the older one. But I'd say the last time we went was in 2017. We were actually going to go this year, but because of COVID, they were pretty shut down. And so my brother actually put together a reunion of all our cousins, because we're pretty much the only Americans in the family. And so we all got together in Holland, and that's where that picture is earlier of the two young ladies. That was during that 2017 was the last time we went. We were, as I said, where we were going to go this year, but last year because of COVID, we canceled. So we do, it's a second home.
But Yvonne, you even went to school there a little bit.
I did, and I showed off that I could skip, and I fell on my face and lost my tooth. And that's my memory of going to school in Amsterdam.
Wonderful. Oh my goodness. Let's see. We do have a question from Sasha, and if any of you feel comfortable answering, you may. A question about whether you practice Judaism currently.
I do. And I was stepped away from Judaism or actually during the war and after the war. I really didn't want to have anything to do with Judaism anymore. But I always missed it, and about 40 years ago, I think now, I went back and attended synagogue again, and I'm, so I do. But the children were not raised Jewish, because that was the time, I married, my husband was not Jewish. And talking about influence of the Holocaust, it has influenced my whole life. I probably would have married a Jewish fellow because I had a request. And, I didn't want it. And so the children grew up actually as Catholics and were not, not exposed too much to Judaism. But I went back, and I'm very happy I can do that.
Yeah, you're very active in your congregation now.
Well, I don't think when 98 you can be very active anymore. But I do get there
involved
weekly, right? Or either on Zoom or now again in person. Last night I was the main speaker last night for the Yom HaShoah memorial.
Right. That's great. Let's see. Looking at other questions, we've kind of gone through the main ones, which is just fine because we're about 2 or 3 minutes out from our end time. Oh, there is a question about whether there are recorded videos of Carla's school presentations available to the public. Yes, I know there are several. I believe there are a few from some university presentations on YouTube. There's also some video on the Holocaust Center website. I'm going to put a link in the chat to Carla's profile on what we call our Survivor Encyclopedia. So it's a resource on our website where there's a page with a profile, bio, primary sources about Holocaust survivors who live in Washington State. So you can reference that.
May I interrupt? Tonight at
Please.
7:30 at KSBS Channel 7 here, they will have a program, Voices of the Holocaust. And Eva Lassman, who passed away, and Cora Kokorian will be on there, and I will be on there too. It will be shown for the first time, and that is a video which is available for schools. And Gonzaga is making one.
That's right. That's right. You have a lot of projects going on, Carla. I know it's hard to keep track. You've got this film that just came out. People at Gonzaga are working on another film about you. It's an incredible legacy that you are sharing with us. So, well, I want to thank the three of you from the bottom of my heart. I mean, sharing personal comments and reflections. I know that it might not always be easy, and we're just so thankful to be together with you today, even on Zoom. In fact, that was probably the only way we could do this, with the three of you in different states, with myself in Seattle and Akiva in the South Sound, and we're all over the place. So just a huge thanks to all three of you, Carla, Yvonne, and Marian, for taking part in this conversation. And thanks, Akiva. I know we're close to the end time, so I guess I'll pass it back to you to conclude.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Marian. And also from the center, Paul and Ilana. I know Ilana's not in the call, but thank you so much. And I couldn't have said it better. You know, Carla, I put in the chat, you may not have seen it, may you live to be 120, and Kol HaKavod. It's an honor to hear from you. And my heart was touched today, seeing the pictures of the two girls that you helped live. My wife just had our daughter, our firstborn, on the 15th. So it had me tearing up thinking of our own daughter. And, you know, I hope to God she has people like that in her life looking after her as you did. So here on the screen, I'm sharing the contact information for Paul, Julia, myself, in case you want to ask any questions or you have any need for support on getting Holocaust education into your district or school. And additionally, we'll be reaching out through announcements via PD Enroller with some of the resource, the links, the slides, and some of that kind of information to help you with what we shared today. So thank you so much for being here with us. And I think that will be it. And we can conclude today's event. So have a great rest of your week and we'll be in touch.